Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Give Yourself Some Leeway, with me, your host, Eugene Lee. Now today I want to cover procrastination. What is procrastination exactly? And why do we do it? This is something that, when I first started Leeway.ie, it was so hard to juggle work while trying to start up a business, as well as doing research and trying to do project deadlines and trying to get around to household chores. Trying to juggle everything and strike a balance, I often found myself procrastinating things or languishing and then feeling guilty because I wasn't being productive with my time. So that's why today I want to share with you what is procrastination exactly, how it affects us and why it affects us so, and what we can do to help curb it and increase our productivity and strike that healthy work-life balance. Now, what is procrastination exactly? It isn't a recent phenomenon. The earliest definition I could find was Aristotle. And Aristotle phrased it as akrasia, acting against your better judgment even when the best course of action is obvious. But why do we find it so hard to stick to our good intentions when we know that taking action is the best course? Why do we always find ourselves putting off what we know we should be working on? And most importantly, why are we labelled as being lazy for procrastinating? And why are we made feel guilty about it? Now, I know that's a lot of questions to take at once, but it really gets the brain ticking if you just take a moment and reflect. Because the first step to overcoming this procrastination is understanding where it comes from, where the root of the procrastination lies. And just like anyone who procrastinates, I'm sure you can relate to the following symptoms or signs. So when you procrastinate, you often feel stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, or depressed, either before you procrastinate or after procrastinating on a task. You might feel frustrated that you let an opportunity pass you by because you couldn't meet the deadline. You leave very important tasks until there's no time left to do them justice. Sometimes it's just a matter of you have low self-esteem and you feel as that, you're just inherently lazy and just not motivated to carry out a task. Or maybe you just lack confidence in carrying out that task, so you leave it off and say, hey, just let someone else do that. And you make these internal excuses about why you can't do the task, why you're just not up for it. And you have this discomfort with change, that you just you don't feel up to the task, you're just not good enough. Now, some of you probably feel personally attacked or triggered by these symptoms. And don't worry, that's normal. I felt triggered too when I first deep dived into procrastination and this whole topic. But the first step to recovering is admitting and understanding your weaknesses, because only then can you identify your true strength. Understanding this is your first step, so that you can overcome procrastination. But why do we really procrastinate? This is where I like to get a little bit sciencey. In our minds, there are two systems at war: the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. You can think of the limbic system as your impulsive friend, the one who likes to book last-minute holidays or go shopping in the middle aisle. They look for that immediate gratification. They have no concept of delayed rewards. Your limbic system is kind of like your caveman brain that has to think about instant gratification now just to survive another day. There is almost no concept of delaying rewards for the future. On the other side, we have the prefrontal cortex. And in terms of human evolution, it's considerably younger than the limbic system. But it plays a critical role because if we can't make long-term decisions and attribute the meaning to things, to delay gratification for a long-time reward, then we would rarely think more than 24 hours ahead. So when our mind is constantly at war between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, who wins the majority of these battles? It's like the prefrontal cortex is constantly fighting an uphill battle against our limbic system's strong pull towards that immediate gratification. So when your prefrontal cortex is telling you to sit down for 2 hours and just do the deep work, your limbic system is like, hey, let's watch 2 hours of Netflix. Now you can see where it gets tricky for the prefrontal cortex. And it's not just a battle of these two sides. Even when we want to do something good for ourselves for the future, it can be difficult to just get started. It's like our brains are really good at convincing us of things that simply aren't true. It's like your brain telling you, oh, you work better under pressure, and that's why you don't get started now. And that's when you fall down the rabbit hole of looking for last minute extensions on projects and stressing yourself out over a deadline. So can we hack our brain? Can we make decisions using our prefrontal cortex when our limbic system is constantly trying to undermine us? One of the first steps to curbing our procrastination is in the understanding of that we are procrastinating. We have to understand and admit to our weaknesses, admit to our problems, and then we can work from there. And why is this so important? It's because chronic procrastination has been linked to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and even physical health problems. So let's move on to how to effectively curb your procrastination. Have you ever noticed that it's easier to remember things that you left unfinished? That's because of something called the Zeigarnik effect. Our brains are better at recalling unfinished tasks. The theory is that this happens because once we start a task, our brain categorizes it as unfinished in our minds and keeps track of it until we complete it. And most of the time, getting started is the hardest part. Remember your brain telling you that you work better under pressure? But once you do start, your brain will do a lot of the work for you. Sometimes it just runs on autopilot in the back of your head. Do you remember sometimes you might start a task and get a complete mental block, and then maybe 2 weeks later you're going for a walk or you're in the shower and it just clicks? It hasn't been your focus for the past 2 weeks, but somewhere in your brain it has been processing over the 2 weeks, and your brain comes up with the solution. All you had to do was just get started. So here's how you could use the Zeigarnik effect to your advantage. First, find a small part of the task that you can do in a few minutes. And if possible, make it enjoyable. For example, let's say you have to create a presentation. So focus on formatting the fonts and colors for your presentation rather than trying to come up with the content. Now that you've started the task, add it to your list of in-progress tasks to solidify the Zeigarnik effect in your mind. Now, from this point, your brain knows that that task is unfinished, and it will work in the background to remind you to complete it. But let's be realistic. The Zeigarnik effect isn't going to cure every case of procrastination in your mind. But it is a great tool to add to your arsenal. It will work in some cases, particularly those small annoying tasks that you just never get around to. Now for the second technique, let's just entertain our limbic system for a second. Which is more attractive or gives more gratification? Doing 25 minutes of deep work or 2.5 hours of deep work? 25 minutes will be over quicker, so that's more attractive for your limbic system, and therefore you're more likely to actually do it. And this is exactly the kind of thinking behind the Pomodoro technique. It's a time management strategy for dealing with procrastination. Now, the basic idea of this is to break down your work into small 25-minute chunks and to take regular breaks in between. So for every 25 minutes worked, you take a 5-minute break, then another 25 minutes work, and a 5-minute break, and so on. So the thinking behind it is that by breaking your work down into smaller chunks, it makes it more achievable and less daunting. And by allowing yourself to take regular breaks, it gives these little rewards to your brain and keeps it motivated. This is why the Pomodoro technique is actually one of the more popular techniques out there, and it's one that I personally like to use too. I use it using the app called pomofocus.io, which sets a 25-minute timer, and then a 5-minute break timer, and then back to 25 minutes again, and so on. The Zeigarnik effect and the Pomodoro technique aside, there's nothing quite like the guilt and shame of being a chronic procrastinator. You berate yourself for being lazy, undisciplined, and unproductive. But all this self-criticism does is make you feel worse and increase your anxiety about the task that you have at hand. What if, instead of beating yourself up about it, you treated yourself with compassion? Believe it or not, the simple act of forgiving and forgetting can be extremely powerful. Suddenly, you don't identify yourself as a lazy idiot. You're human, just like the rest of us. And humans are imperfect creatures who just sometimes need a little grace. Sometimes you just need to create that space and give yourself some leeway. I mean, without self-compassion, that procrastination just becomes a lot more difficult to beat. So the next time you're feeling guilty about putting off a report or chores or a deadline, just try to cut yourself some slack. Refocus and make a small step towards that task. Well, I hope you liked this episode and I hope you found it helpful. And if you did, subscribe to the show, because it makes sure that you don't miss out on new episodes. And it also helps me because it increases the rankings of the show a little bit, which of course makes it a little more easily found by other people who may like it just as much as you. And if you didn't like this episode or anything about the show in general, or if you have any ideas or suggestions or just feedback that you want to share, shoot me an email, eugene@leeway.ie, and let me know what I could do better, or just what your thoughts are on what you'd like to see me do in the future. I read everything myself. I'm always looking for new ideas and constructive feedback. So thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope to hear from you soon.